Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I am joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. What's going on, Josh?
Hey, Will, doing all right. How are you?
I am living my best life. Thanks for asking. And joining us today, we have Brandon Bloch, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specializing in modern European history, political theology, and human rights. His work explores how religion, nationalism, and democracy intersected in the 20th century Germany, particularly in the aftermath of World War II. His recent book, Reinventing Protestant Germany, it's right here for the YouTube listeners or watchers that are watching. The Religious Nationalists and the Contest for Post-Nazi Democracy, where he examines how German Protestants grappled with rebuilding their faith and moral authority in a democratic world. And we were just so happy to have him on the show. So welcome to the show, Brandon.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. We always like talking to really, really smart people, especially smart people that write books about things that we don't really understand, or at least I don't understand. So we're just so happy to have you on. But for listeners that might be unfamiliar with the history, of Germany at the time and sort of like the Christian sort of integration, give us some understanding of like what drew you to study like this thing. It seems very, very specialized. So I'd love to just hear like, how did you get into this and why study the intersection between religion and democracy in post-war Germany?
Yeah, sure. So I lived in Germany for the first time after I graduated from college in 2011-12. I was a English teaching assistant through the Fulbright program. And that's when I got interested in these questions around religious dynamics. I'm also Jewish, and I was working for a Jewish organization at the same time as I was teaching there. And we often tend to think of, at least coming from a US context, we think of Western Europe as being a kind of very secular society, as opposed to the US, which is sometimes seen as a sort of anomaly among Western democracies for having more active religious participation. And that's to some extent true, but I noticed a lot of interesting religious dynamics when I was living in Germany that first time around 20 years after the end of the Cold War. There was a large population of students with a Muslim background at the school where I was teaching, and one could see a certain degree of tension sometimes between especially the older generation of teachers and students around issues of observing Ramadan or wearing the hijab. I also noticed that even though Germany is officially the secular society, religion is still offered as a subject, and in many states a required subject, in public schools, oftentimes supervised by the Protestant and Catholic churches. And then working for a Jewish organization, I got interested also in sort of the position of the Jewish minority. At one point, I participated in a so-called German Israel Day and was really struck by the number of Catholic nuns and other people with kind of visibly sort of Christian clothing who were participating in this Israel Day. So all of these dynamics really got me sort of interested in thinking kind of how that came from. The religious landscape was quite different from what I was used to growing up kind of Jewish in the suburbs in the US, but still really dynamic and not irrelevant. So that's kind of how I got into the topic and interested in thinking about maybe how some of these dynamics have their origins in this effort to kind of grapple with the Nazi past.
I absolutely love that. I think I'm on this history kick in the last 3 years. I consider myself like an amateur many things, like jack of all trades, master of none kind of thing, and I love history. And I've recently been listening to history on World War II, on Nazi Germany. And here's an interesting thing. And I would love for you to kind of, I want to give you just a little bit of context, and then I'd love for you to kind of level set for us and help us understand the spiritual climate of kind of Nazi Germany, or even before that kind of led to this. So there is this speech, and I could pull it up, but I don't remember off the top of my head, that Hitler was giving, I think to the Reichstag. I think that's how you say it, right?
Yes.
He was giving the speech. I think maybe it was in 1939, maybe, but essentially he was saying, hey, look, you Western nations, you don't take care of your churches. look what we've given. We've given this many Reich marks in 1933, this many 100 million in 1934, this many 100 million. And so his point was like, we are religious, because there's like something that was leveled against the Nazis was that they weren't religious, or he was trying to address this. And I just thought it was fascinating that he was literally taunting and then almost like subtly threatening the Protestant churches, even saying like separation of church and state, which in Germany would have meant money is gone, essentially, right? I think, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, please. Like, I would love if you would correct all of my my inaccuracies. That would be really nice. But I guess the question is, why was that a significant thing that Hitler said? Why would he even say that? Why did it matter? Why did he even talk about the church at all? And can you help us answer that question? I'm sure you can.
Yeah, I think, it's helpful to back up a little bit. I think especially from, an American context, what's so unfamiliar sometimes about how Christianity functions in kind of Northern and Western Europe. So our churches, but other religious organizations as well in the United States would fall into a label that the Germans call free churches, or Freikirchen in German. So this idea that religious organizations are essentially nonprofit institutions that operate without the official sanction of the state. Of course, the disestablishment clause in the U.S. Constitution is deeply contested, and one could get into that very long history. But suffice it to say that the North America in the early modern period was settled in part by people who represented these kind of free denominations that were seeking to escape religious persecution by state-sponsored churches in Europe. And some have argued, I think quite convincingly, that this system of sort of free churches is why so many different Protestant denominations have flourished in the United States. In contrast, in Germany, but also in other Northern European countries, and this is a legacy going all the way back to the Reformation, even today, there's still this system of state-sponsored churches. So in Germany, the official Protestant and Catholic churches are classified is this category called corporations of public law. Which means they're these kind of quasi-public institutions. So they collect their revenues primarily through the tax system. So members pay a church tax as part of their taxes to the state that goes to the church. And they can also exercise these public functions. So I mentioned even in secular Germany, religious education is still a public school subject, and actually the only subject that's mandated to be taught in public schools according to the post-war German constitution. So I think one needs to understand that to understand the larger religious picture. And even as already from the early 20th century, Germany is becoming increasingly secular, the churches still remain these large institutions with tens of millions of members, in part because membership is based on this kind of opt-out structure, right? People are born into the church, and you're sort of automatically registered and pay the tax unless you make this very sort of conscious political decision to leave. So it's a different kind of system from the US. And in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, 95% of the German population is a member either of the Protestant or Catholic Church. Jews only make up less than 1% of the country, which might seem kind of ironic given how much sort of, how obsessed the Nazis are with this kind of Jewish conspiracy. They're actually a very small minority. The vast majority of people, even the kind of increasingly secularized working classes, are still officially members of the church. So therefore, the churches in some sense are as these large institutions, the only institutions that really could potentially have the possibility of kind of challenging Nazi dominance over society. So the Nazis couldn't quite roll over them the same way they did other institutions, in this kind of process of negotiation and sort of compromise is happening. And I think that's, I could get into more details, but I think that's why Hitler, even as he's violating the terms of the treaties he signed with the churches, also has to appeal to this idea of, respecting Christianity, because that was still an important point of identification for much of the German middle classes that essentially formed his political base.
So your title's called Reinventing Protestant Germany. Can you just help us sort of understand? And I think you alluded a little bit to it, but make the distinction a little bit clearer, if there is one, differences between sort of Protestants in the German context and then sort of Protestant in like what we have in America. Like in America, we have like, your mainline Protestants, and I don't know them all by heart.
Pentecostals, evangelicals,
Yeah.
all the different
Yeah. So,
denominations.
like, is it different? Is it different in Germany than it is here in America, contextually? And, if you want to use sort of the generational context, as well. But then probably more importantly is like, what is it reinventing itself from?
Yeah, so I'll try to take those questions in turn. So, the denominational landscape is certainly quite different in Germany. And there's sort of interesting linguistic issue. So in Germany, the word we would use for Protestant is evangelisch. But when I was doing my research, and especially I met a number of pastors early on, I wasn't doing sort of formal interviews, but just kind of getting their perspective on the history of the church. And they would always have to inform me that when we say evangelisch, we don't mean evangelical, right? Because they sort of associate evangelical with, a kind of fundamentalist or oftentimes politically kind of far-right denominations in the United States, whereas for them sort of evangelisch means more kind of mainline Protestant. But briefly, so the dominant denominations in the German context are Lutheran, which is the majority of Protestants, and then also Reformed, which is something closer to what we would probably call Presbyterian or Calvinist in the United States. And this is largely shaped by this sort of system of the corporations of public law. So there are sort of regional churches. Different states in Germany have a Protestant church corresponding to that region. Oftentimes the regional divisions date back to the early modern period. So if you look at like the map of the, Holy Roman Empire or sort of pre-Napoleonic Germany, oftentimes the kind of church divisions correspond more to those divisions than the contemporary German states. But the Lutheran churches are dominant more in the northern part of Germany. The western part, you have pockets where the Reformed churches were more influential. And at the time the Nazis come to power in 1933, Germany is a majority. So I mentioned 95% of the population is officially Christian. About 2/3 are members of one of those large Protestant denominations, either Lutheran or Reformed. There are also free churches in Germany. So there were sort of American evangelizing missions that came from the 19th century onward of Baptists. There's a small Mormon church. There are also Anabaptist groups. So Mennonites, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses that have sort of complicated histories. But those are all quite small groups. And what I'm talking about primarily are the sort of more dominant sort of state-sponsored Lutheran and Reformed churches, which really have this kind of connection that I get into in the book to sort of German national identity. They have these sort of large, powerful institutions that have this very complicated history during the Nazi period and then have to try to figure out sort of how to renegotiate that after 1945. So I feel like I've answered your first question about sort of how the confessional landscape looks different, and then there's the reinventing question. But I want to give you maybe the chance to jump in before
I do want you, so I'm going to give you a chance to answer that question, and maybe I can add just a little bit more context, because I think this is what we're getting at. So one of the things from your book, that basically the same Protestant context of people, they were twice as likely as Catholics to vote Nazi in 1830 through 32, or in those two elections. Is that correct? So they then became this engine of like constitutionalism in Germany. Would you say that's correct?
Right. So that's kind of the thesis for the book.
What the heck happened?
Yeah.
I guess that's like how can these people that are Nazis then create a constitution? And I guess then that creates all these other tensions. Like, wait, what does that mean? Is it still the same constitution? Is it still the same religious? Like what are, it's kind of like in America with slavery, right? And then the kind of Jim Crow system of oppression, right? So it's like, yeah, we've moved on, but have we moved on? That kind of tension, right? That we see, is that, like, does that help in terms of like where we want to go with the answer? We're trying to understand, like, how did that happen? And can it happen here? Is it happening here? Those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of ideas, like,
Mm-hmm.
how do we identify it? So go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the first sort of part of that, right? So where I start off, and the finding that Protestants were twice as likely as Catholics to vote for the Nazi Party, even when controlling for factors of different regions, gender,
Man,
class.
that's
This has been
disappointing, but it tracks, Brandon. It's disappointing, but it tracks. Sorry, go ahead.
and again, my goal is so this is something that there's been kind of sociological historians, right, who do kind of quantitative. So I don't, alas, I had, though I was a math minor in college, I don't do kind of quantitative analysis in my work. So that finding has come from kind of historians that have really dug in, German historians who have, dug into sort of the quantitative data, looked at sort of district by district electoral returns and so forth. But what I'm interested really is more of the cultural aspect. So for Catholics in Germany, as a sort of minority religion, there was more of, I think, a sense of the kind of coherence of the Catholic milieu. And even in the early 1930s, there was a kind of specifically Catholic party called the Center Party that continued to attract much of the vote and remained somewhat more impervious to the appeal of Nazism. For Protestants who had voted for a range of sort of moderate, kind of liberal to conservative parties that seemed really unable to control the depression of the early 1930s, the Nazis do have this appeal as a party that can kind of get Germany out of its crisis and sort of move beyond it. And there was also, I think, this attraction of many sort of active Protestant churchgoers to ideas of German nationalism. There's a notion for a lot of them that Protestants should represent not simply kind of confessional interests, which is how they sort of box the Catholic Church in, but rather sort of the interests of the nation, of the people as a whole. And the Nazis, in some sense, sort of claim to do that. And the Nazis also have this idea of positive Christianity, which they claim is sort of an allegiance to kind of Christian ideas that rises above the sort of particular denominational sort of infighting. And this was appealing to a lot of Protestant churchgoers. So there is this kind of attraction that happens in the early 1930s. And then, as I show in the book, after 1945, there's a number of prominent pastors and lay intellectuals who get involved in establishing the post-war German constitution and kind of movements for the expansion of constitutional democracy. So how do you explain that? And a lot of what I focus on in part is sort of what happens during the Nazi period and the legacies of it afterward. So during the Nazi period itself, sort of early on, 1933, there's this real hope among, I think, a lot of sort of active Protestant voters, right, who had voted for the Nazis, that the Nazis would become this kind of engine of religious revival. They really believed in this notion of sort of positive Christianity. It would move beyond the kind of secularism that Germany had experienced in the Weimar Republic. But this doesn't really happen, right? What the Nazis start doing is sort of putting pressure on the churches, removing their right to offer religious education and things like that. So, and the situation sort of fragments, where you have sort of one faction within the church that becomes sort of very adamantly pro-Nazi, called the German Christians. Another group that your listeners might be familiar with, called the Confessing Church, which is associated with the Barmen Declaration, with famous pastors like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, which wasn't really necessarily a resistance organization against the Nazi state, but does reject that kind of theological idea that the church should sort of simply serve the state. And they say instead the church should preserve, its own sort of sphere of autonomy from the Nazi state. And after the war, people who were associated with that movement positioned themselves sort of, right, they gained the sort of moral legitimacy to become sort of leaders of the post-war church, and oftentimes advertised this sort of narrative of anti-Nazi resistance, which didn't completely track with what had actually happened under the regime, but gives them a certain degree of legitimacy, I think, to represent the German people before kind of the Allied occupation governments, and to play a role in post-war constitution making. And I think from this notion of resistance, or at least the church as a more sort of autonomous sphere from the state, you start seeing Protestants sort of adopt human rights language, adopt the idea that the Christian community isn't there simply to sort of serve the state and its interests, but rather to sort of form a bulwark against the overextension of state power. So there is an interest, especially in the Cold War context, that we can get into in ideas of sort of constitutionalism and human rights. But at the same time, as you point out, right, and maybe the analogy to sort of post-Civil War is interesting. It's not a total repudiation of the past, because there isn't that, even as their ideas are shifting, there's not a fully kind of honest reckoning with what had actually happened to National Socialism and what had led so many Protestants down that path. So that's my attempt to give you a sort of 4-minute summary.
I know
but I'm
Will
happy to
has
get
a
into
question.
more of these ideas.
No,
yes.
but that was so helpful. Thank you, because it's like that's what we're all wondering. How can you be a Nazi Christian? So anyway, or a Christian Nazi? Which way is it, Will? Which way is it?
Yeah, well, I think you always have to put the Christian first, and then any sort of hyphenation
there you
afterwards.
go. Yes,
I mean, if you're a real Christian, I'm guessing. But I am curious though, Brennan. So I'm not an expert on Nazi history or culture or whatever, and I was just telling my wife, actually, we were walking our kids to school this morning. And I was like telling her about this interview, and I was like, I don't really know much. I mean, I know about the Nazis, but like, I know about the bad stuff, but like, I don't know about like the governing, philosophy or anything that led up to what we know as World War II. But like you've mentioned a bunch of times, Nazis and kind of the context of the 1930s and whatnot. So like, can you just help us better understand like who were the Nazis, prior to World War II?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize there's several different phases. So Nazi is a kind of shorthand for National Socialist German Workers' Party. So it's the Nationalsozialisten. So that's where you get kind of the Nazi. And this is, I think there's this idea among some sectors that, well, because they call themselves, National Socialists, therefore they were really kind of socialists and communists, and that's how we can kind of explain them. I think that the name was in part a kind of clever effort in the context of the early 90s. Right. So I mean, I'll just start. I mean, the Nazis are founded amidst the sort of chaos of post World War I Germany. Right. In 1918, Germany had been a monarchy. The monarchy was destroyed in 1918. The monarch abdicates following World War I. A new republic is founded, but that republic finds itself on quite tenuous grounds. It's associated by its enemies, which include especially much of the former military establishment, with German defeat and with the post-war republic. There's this idea of a so-called stab in the back myth. So a lot of the sort of former World War I generals in Germany that had lost the war basically turned around and blamed the loss on kind of the domestic population. So they said it was sort of Jews and socialists at home who stabbed Germany in the back. And at the beginning of the 1918, it's the socialists who were in control of the post-war government. They were sort of the largest and sort of most reliable non-monarchy political faction, right? So the Republic, for its enemies, is associated with with socialists and Jews, and there's a number of these kind of factions emerging out of especially minorities among veterans, but sort of disgruntled veterans groups, right? That sort of say, we fought this war and, what was it all for? We lost and were stabbed in the back and so forth. And so the Nazi Party is founded in 1920, is one among many of these kind of revanchist groups that sort of thinks that Germany's loss in the war and its kind of treatment by the victors of World War I was illegitimate. And the Nazis remain really this kind of small, politically largely irrelevant faction all the way up until the Depression in 1930. So in 1928, for instance, when the Republic is sort of on an upswing economically, they run for the first time at parliamentary elections and get less than 3% of the vote, right? So this narrative that Germany was sort of, Germans were all Nazis and sort of, things were inevitably going that direction is not necessarily true for a number of reasons, both because of the context of the Depression, but also Hitler's success in kind of manipulating the mass media of the time. they become the largest party by 1932, and ultimately Hitler is appointed as chancellor in 1933 by a kind of clique of political elites and industrialists, with the backing, incidentally, of the Protestant churches.
Brandon, can I interrupt you just for a second?
1933. Sure.
So can you just go, because I think this is really important in this context. Can you just go into a little bit more of the detail? Like, so when we say they were the largest party, you mean like, I think what was like 38%, 39, 40% of the vote, maybe? Yeah. So like, we think America, Democrat, Republican. And so we think, oh, they had a majority. The Nazis had a majority of the vote, but that's not true. And right. And I just, and even how Hitler got to power, because I think it's so important that people understand that Germans weren't these evil, horrible people that were trying to bring a tyrant into power, right? They were normal people in a very difficult situation. Again, challenge this if this is a bad interpretation. But like, yeah, because because I guess the core in our heart, all of us, is like, that happened then, it can't happen again. Like, we just don't want to believe it can happen again. So we want them to be weird, crazy lunatics who put this megalomaniac into power. Are you understanding what I'm getting at? I can try to make it more clear, but because how Hitler actually came into power through almost like deception and manipulation, I just think that would be good for people to know. And then even addressing how it is that this populace could take on this ideology in the way they did. And literally within 4 years, because you said they had less than 3% of the vote. Right. And then went to the largest party. That's enormous. So I just think, what in the world? What's going on? It's help us understand it a little.
Sure. I mean, and just to, so similar, and then we can we'll kind of circle back to the churches and all of this. But so I spoke about how Germany has this different system of religion and politics, right? There's also, like many European parliaments, it has a system of what's called proportional representation. So in U.S. elections, we have this idea of first past the post. So essentially, whichever party gets the most votes in a particular congressional district, regardless if they get a majority, they go to Congress. In Germany, each electoral district has sort of multiple representatives, and they're allocated based on proportion. So therefore, it's not just kind of like one or the other, Democrat, Republican, right? But even, and in the Weimar context, so today the German system has been tightened up. Now a party has to win at least 5%, I believe, in a particular, at the national level to get into parliament. But in the system of the 1920s, a party could win as little as 1% and still be represented, right? So there's really this kind of very fragmentary system. There were up to 40 different parties represented in the parliament in the context of the 1920s. So in theory, on the one hand, right, this is, a more kind of authentically democratic system, right? I think we see in our own society that there's, it's kind of problematic when people, need to kind of pick just one or the other political camp when that doesn't, really describe, many of our views. But on the other hand, when you have, 40 different parties, this can also create like an extreme dysfunction. So kind of how do you balance? But what happened was, after the Depression hits, the coalition kind of ceases to function. The socialists wanted to pursue a policy of, raising unemployment benefits, more similar to what Roosevelt, will do in the United States, sort of government spending to stimulate the economy. The conservatives argue for austerity, and no one can really agree. And ultimately, Germany only ends up with a kind of minority coalition. So the parties that are willing to serve it, able to serve in government, make up less than 50% of the actual parliament, right? Because that's what you have with this proportional representation. Like, you're not guaranteed to have a coalition that actually has more than 50% as you are in a two-party system. So what ends up happening is you get this system of a kind of quasi-dictatorship where the parliament can't establish laws based on a majority. So the president invokes the emergency authority of the Constitution in order to start passing these austerity measures, which don't actually help resolve the economic crisis.
So there is a president and a chancellor. Sorry, just like there's two different things. Is that like vice president, president?
No, so in European systems, so our president essentially serves as both head of state and head of government. The president occupied the position that more like the monarch would have occupied in the old system, kind of head of state, maybe more similar to like the British monarchy. And today, the president in Germany doesn't really have a lot of significant political power. But at the time, I think because of partly the legacy of the old sort of monarchical system, the president who was elected but kind of had that role of the monarch to sort of stand above parties and represent the nation as a whole, still had certain constitutional powers that they could invoke in the 1920s, including declaring a state of emergency and effectively ruling by decree. Which was what started happening in the early 1930s. So there was already this kind of democratic backsliding and dysfunction that was going on. The economic crisis was deepening. There was a major bank failure in Vienna in mid-1931. Employment spikes at around a quarter of the population. And that's really the political context in which the Nazis are coming to power. I would note also that communism, this is also the era of like the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. Communism, ironically,
and they were significant in Germany, right? Communism has significant
15,
presence.
16%, largely among unemployed workers. So that's kind of the irony that communists are the party of the workers, but it was largely the unemployed that gravitated toward them.
It makes sense.
This unemployment crisis, right? Because that's that's who is kind of this radical solution is appealing to. And then so the Nazis kind of also play on both the disillusionment with the kind of established liberal and conservative sort of middle-class parties that were in this kind of minority coalition, but unable really to govern, and their policies were not effectively addressing the economic crisis. Then you have sort of the threat of communism, and this threat of communist revolution, which sort of right-wing German forces had played on going all the way back to 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. And then you also have anti-Semitism, which, interestingly, a lot of historians have suggested this wasn't necessarily a primary driver of why a lot of people voted for the Nazis. And oftentimes people sort of became anti-Semitic as a result of voting for the Nazi party, right? So they voted for the Nazi party and then had to kind of justify why they had made that decision, given that the Nazis also spewed, of course, this anti-Semitic rhetoric, blaming Jews for the, Jewish financiers for the economic crisis and so forth. So people increasingly sort of embraced those ideas to sort of justify their own political decisions, but initially it was largely kind of the depression, the communist threat that was motivating people to vote for the Nazis. The final thing I'll say about this is the Nazis win 37% in July of 1932, only 33% in November of 1932 when another election is held. So they actually lose about 10% of their vote, and Hitler is appointed chancellor in January of 33. So he recognizes that the economy was actually improving.
How was he appointed chancellor? How did this happen?
So how was he appointed
chancellor?
I'm
just like, how in the world could this happen?
So Germany is still facing, this sort of crisis of governance. What you have essentially, in the parliament, so November of 1932, the Nazis win 33%, but the communists win 17%. So combined, you have basically two anti-democratic parties that constitute 51% of the parliament. Right, so the parliament is sort of completely dysfunctional. And according to the German constitution, the president appoints the the president is popularly elected, but the chancellor was not. The chancellor, the head of government, is appointed by the president. The president at the time, ironically enough, was one of these, a man named Paul von Hindenburg, about 86, 87 years old. So not necessarily in the sort of gerontocracy problem, not necessarily in the sharpest
prime
of his
life. That's why they gave him president for life.
So he was interestingly, he was a former military general who had already retired. He was born in 1847. He had already retired from the military before World War I. He had been called out of retirement to serve as a general on the Eastern Front in World War I, where he was responsible for a series of important German victories against Russia during the First World War. So Germany actually kind of wins the war against Russia on the Eastern Front and only loses after America gets into the war, and they lose on the West and have to capitulate. But this General Hindenburg was still seen as a kind of hero because of his victory on the Eastern Front. And he was one of these people that propagated this whole stab in the back. Like, the military didn't lose the war, it was really the socialists, and so on and so forth. Now, he gets elected in 1925. Some historians argue that actually sort of stabilizes the Republic, because for sort of more kind of patriotic, like right-leaning Germans, Hindenburg is a figure who, as the president, represents the Republic, but also the more kind of traditional, old German aristocracy. But needless to say, he's not a kind of Democrat by conviction. He's also 85, 86 years old and sort of easily kind of manipulated by the clique around him. And ultimately, he's convinced by a group of sort of industrialists and bankers who Hitler has been kind of negotiating with over the course of 1932. Hitler increasingly, is promising the kind of business elites that he'll be able to sort of stabilize government and bring about a solution to the economic crisis. He'll kind of deal with the communist threat that's increasingly present. And ultimately, there's a group of bankers that kind of mediates these negotiations between Hindenburg, Hitler, and a number of other politicians. Right, and the Nazis still have this popular base that constitutes a third of the country, which, yes, is a minority, but they're also the plurality. They're the largest political group. They're also heavily armed. They have kind of paramilitaries and so forth. So it's in that context that ultimately, I think, 86-year-old Hindenburg is convinced to appoint Hitler chancellor. Now, the final thing I'll say about that is important to note. Hitler comes to chancellor not just in a Nazi government, but in a coalition government, right? So I mentioned already, his party is still a minority party. So they come in coalition with another group called the German National People's Party, who represent more kind of traditional conservatives, also are the party that's primarily supported by active Protestants. So there's this idea within that party that Hitler can sort of easily be manipulated and controlled, right? He's this kind of rabble-rouser. He gives good speeches, but he's coming to power in a coalition with the kind of serious conservatives who will kind of tamp down those more populist energies. And that's partly what allows Hindenburg and more establishment conservatives to make their peace with Hitler. Now, of course, he ultimately manipulates his way around them very effectively after 1933. But that helps to explain, I think, why he comes to power, and also the appeal for sort of more traditional Protestants who sort of back that other conservative party that's in coalition with Hitler. But there's this sense, okay, if these forces come together, they'll bring kind of order and stability and kind of tamp down the more radical energies of Hitler. Again, that doesn't happen, but that's kind of the theory at the outset. And of course, Hitler also uses the kind of Christian language to appeal to those more kind of establishment conservative groups as well.
Yeah. So,
so that's, I hope that provides some clarification.
It provided
you don't understand. Like, I'm texting
amount of clarification.
Yeah, it was so good. Sorry, go ahead. Well, I'm just saying, like, this is. Yeah, I won't say what I'm texting. Yeah, but anyway, good.
Like in the American, I don't know, imagination, context, whatever. Like, I've never thought of like Nazi Germany as being very religious. I've always thought of them as being very secular, anti-religious even. Yet you make a pretty good case that like Protestantism, I always have a hard time with that word, and nationalism were a lot more closely intertwined. And I'd love for you to just kind of explain like how did that partnership evolve or develop, you know, and was there a time where the leadership in government saw sort of the religious voting bloc as very beneficial for what they're trying to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Protestant nationalism as a sort of ideology, I mean, it has its roots certainly before the 1920s and the era of the Nazis. It really is rooted back in the era of the sort of mid-19th century. And this goes in part, I mean, I mentioned those sort of long-standing sort of state-church ties, right? Where the churches, they're these kind of quasi-official political bodies, and that makes them, I think, amenable or vulnerable, depending on how you see it, to kind of becoming more sort of embracing nationalism in the sort of classical age of European nationalism, right? Really in the mid-19th century, when you start seeing the different groups within Europe are sort of trying to fight for their freedom from kind of long-standing dynastic empires and drawing on kind of nationalistic ideas. And in the German context, it's actually the sort of Prussia, this large empire, that brings about the German nation state through a series of wars of unification in the 1860s. And you get the German Empire in 1871. And there's a number of prominent Protestant pastors at the time who are very supportive of those developments. You start to see the emergence of this kind of chosen people theology. So the Germans is God's chosen people. Prussia's victory in the wars of unification is a sign of sort of German chosenness by God. And of course, this kind of ideology is not, unique to Germany. You can see it in sort of other nationalizing states as well. In Protestants, largely, I mentioned Germany also has, already from the late 19th, early 20th century, a kind of significant socialist movement that's moving away from the churches. So in part, church-going Protestants tended to be more part of the kind of middle to upper classes, the people who sort of benefited economically from German unity and kind of its powerful economy. But nationalism was also advanced by sort of pastors and church leaders, in part as a way of trying to win back sort of workers to the church, right? Appeal to sort of, German workers' kind of patriotic sentiments, to win them away from sort of international socialism and back to a kind of patriotic Christian identity. One sees this especially in the First World War, when you have a majority of sort of Protestant pastors across Germany sort of supporting the war effort, sort of reviving these ideas of sort of God is on our side. Again, not totally unique to Germany, right? The Anglican Church, for instance, in the UK is very supportive of the British war effort. But World War I serves in part to kind of break down, this sort of international missionary movement that was also emerging before the war and really reinforce those currents of Protestant nationalism. And then in the 1920s, again, as Germany becomes this kind of secular republic, more traditional Protestants tend to associate the republic again with these kind of subversive socialist forces, and the appeal to nationalism is a way of trying to kind of regain their role in their political relevance that they feel that they're losing in the context of the 1920s. So there is this long-standing, and again, this isn't to say, there's multiple, of course, I'm simplifying, there's also more kind of liberal currents in the church. There's also, groups that are arguing for a more kind of internationalist ideology, even in the 1920s, that want the German church to be participating more in the kind of international ecumenical movement that's especially associated with like European missionary organizations at the time. But still, much of the laity, right, really believes that Germany was treated unfairly by the Allies after World War I and embraces a more kind of nationalistic rhetoric. Now, I think what's interesting, you mentioned, right, we oftentimes think of like the churches in Nazi Germany as being kind of anti-Nazi, anti-nationalist resistance organizations. And this is an idea that actually dates back to the war and even the 1930s itself, and that comes not only from Germany, but also from a number of prominent British and American clergy who had contacts with the Confessing Church, which was this group of German Protestants, again, associated with people like Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who were not necessarily anti-Nazi per se, but who did resist that Nazi effort to kind of take over the churches. And they were projected abroad oftentimes as being members of a kind of political resistance. So already in 1940, Martin Niemöller, I'll mention, so he's the pastor who has post-war this confession, first they came for the communists, then they came for me, so he's quite famous for that. Already in 1940, he appears on the cover of Time magazine, framed by us, and he had been imprisoned at the time by the Nazis for speaking out against the Nazi attempt to take over the church. He's pictured in Time magazine flanked on the one side by a swastika, on the other side by a cross, right? So the message of Time magazine in 1940 is already, the churches are standing up and resisting Nazi Germany. In fact, this was really a simplification of a much more complex reality, but I think certainly appeals to the sensibilities of American and British Christians that wanted to maintain that sense of sort of international Christian solidarity and didn't necessarily want to see those more complex kind of imbrications of Nazism and Christianity, which probably would have, challenged their own faith in complicated ways. So that narrative really actually dates to the even the pre-war period itself.
I mean, I think I just have so many questions, Brandon. I could seriously talk to you for hours. So, we won't do that, but I could. So you said Germany was secularizing, right? So, and yet it was still attached. The Nazis used it again. I just was struck. Hitler, do you remember that speech where he outlines all of the money that the Nazi Party gave to the church over the years? Yeah. So I'm just struck because he was obviously he wasn't wasting words, right? He was trying to appeal to something, right? And this sense, even thinking about what Will said, like about this question about, well, man, I really thought Nazi was just like not Christian, but then it is Christian, but it's a certain kind of Christian. But then isn't there an ideology deep inside that's essentially it's racially motivated, and it's and almost like, hey, Christianity became regarded as too Jewish in its origins, and we needed to get back to Norse mythology or whatever. And I guess the reason I'm saying all this stuff is because I think the question that's burning in all of our hearts, mine, there's a couple things, and maybe you can address them in turn as you see, and I'll just kind of throw them out there. One, obviously, the question for me, to my mind, is can we get there today in America? Can this happen? So a couple things. Thinking about the Weimar Republic was what, maybe 15 years old when it collapsed or whatever it was. I mean, its constitution was debated and attacked from the beginning. The Treaty of Versailles, right, likely put the entire thing in the minds of people, like in the German, public, that this is a weak government and that can't really get anything done. And it was a democracy or, something equivalent to that, or some kind of analogy there. But America, we have a 250-year-old constitution, right? That has been tested and tested and tested and tested and tested, right? We have a history. We look at this. We have a two-party system. We don't have the same thing. The government isn't giving money directly to pay church salaries. I don't get a salary from the government. I don't pay taxes to my church, but they still do in Germany, and they did. And yet, it's just like it's kind of like at our heart, like, are we that similar that the same thing that happened in Germany could happen today? Or is it like, no, that's unique to Germany. It can't happen here in the same way. But then what lessons do we derive from?
Sure. So
I know I said a lot there.
Yeah,
so you can, whatever you feel like you want to hit. I hope that I've adequately described the tension.
Right. So yeah. I think I'll start talking, maybe say a little bit more about kind of the context of Nazis and Christians in that speech from 1939, and then sort of the issues about today. I mean, I was listening to your, I think your most recent interview with Brian Kaler, who wrote this book, The Bible According to Christian Nationalists. And I think he was, addressing this similar issue, right? Where for, Christians who don't, identify with Christian nationalism, right? The sort of go-to response of like, well, that's not Christian, right? That's, as he was showing himself, that Christian nationalism rests on this kind of, very tendentious, biblical interpretations that, just try to justify whatever the current administration is doing in ways that actually have very little to do with the actual, more kind of, informed interpretation of the Bible, right? But his point is that it's not, that's a little bit too simple, right? So there's in some sense a tension between, on the one hand, a kind of sort of ideal, this is a very academic way of saying it, sort of ideal typical categories. So in other words, sort of the definitional categories, like what we ideally think sort of Christianity should be, an authentic interpretation of the Bible should be. But then there's also historical categories, right? How people have actually identified as Christians in many different ways and for many different purposes. And one, I think, has to hold those in tension to understand kind of the full history. And certainly in, as I mentioned, after 1933, the church really splits into multiple different kind of wings. So there's one group that wants to go, fully back the Nazis. So this is a group called the German Christians, and they do these kinds of really absurd theological moves that you're talking about, right? So they try to eliminate they circulate copies of scripture that eliminate the Old Testament. They claim the authentic Jesus was actually Aryan, not really Jewish. That Paul also was kind of a corruption of the original message of Jesus. So they have this very kind of twisted and censored version of scripture that's supposed to kind of directly back Nazi ideas. And certainly one could claim, well, they're not, authentically Christians and so forth. On the other hand, one can also trace a very long history, really up through the mid-20th century of anti-Judaism within many different Christian denominations. So in some sense, they were picking up on sort of anti-Jewish currents that existed within Protestantism, even though they're radicalizing them in support of the Nazi regime. And on the other hand, you have people like Niemöller who rejected that kind of interpretation of the Bible in the context of Nazism, right? Called for the church to kind of stand for the authentic witness to Christ and not the Nazi regime. But on the other hand, Niemöller was still himself a German nationalist, and actually a lot of people don't know this. So he was famous from Time magazine for being this great resistor. From his cell in Sachsenhausen at a Nazi concentration camp in 1939, he volunteered to rejoin the German Navy, resume his German naval service, because he felt that it was still important, even though he had sort of his religious ideals, he also thought that he was a patriotic German, right? So there's very different ways that people can kind of negotiate these religious identities. But I think simply to say, well, those people didn't have the right interpretation of scripture, therefore weren't Christian, that's too simplistic, right? They were drawing on Christian ideas that existed at the time and that really had to kind of be deconstructed in various ways after the war. To your question, can this happen here? I mean, I think that historians, well, they'll always say, well, we can't predict the future. And I think, I don't think, is the U.S. today exactly where Germany was, in 1932? Right? No. I mean, Germany had lost this, major cataclysmic war where 2 million, men out of a population of 60 million people had been killed in the war. They were facing economic crisis with a quarter of the country unemployed, already being governed by a kind of presidential dictatorship. And on the other hand, in the U.S., we still have, institutionally, we've still seen the peaceful transition of power, right? So even though the attempt to sort of block that on January 6th of 2021 is obviously extremely concerning for those who believe in democracy, that attempt failed and power was again transferred the other way in 2025. So we're not exactly where Germany was. It was already a presidential dictatorship. But does that mean that there aren't, forces that are eroding and undermining our democracy here? I mean, I think, one can certainly point to, ways in which the sort of balance of power between the three branches of government, sort of at the core of U.S. constitutionalism, is increasingly being challenged in ways that are concerning. And then in terms of how Christian churches are reacting, I mean, I think that, again, like, in Germany in the 30s, right, Christians speak with many different voices, and even more so in the U.S. because there's so many different denominations. We don't have this system of kind of state-sponsored churches. But certainly there are, as Brian Kaler was talking about, right, there are, people for whom this kind of Christian nationalist message, really speaks to them, and who want, the church basically to kind of justify the actions of a particular political authority and are willing to manipulate their readings of scripture accordingly. I don't think any Christian nationalist group in the U.S. has done anything as radical as trying to eliminate the entire Old Testament from scripture. But, nevertheless, can one, and I don't think it's necessarily helpful to describe one's political opponents as the Nazis, right? This is a move that sometimes gets made, but can one, in terms of this kind of manipulation of theology, I mean, this isn't the first time that kind of thing has happened.
I'm curious, just kind of staying in that same context. like here in America, with the rise of Christian nationalism, with Trump in office, we've seen evangelical Christians kind of evolve in their thinking, to kind of use a Jonathan Haidt sort of reference. Like their writer has really been doing a lot of work on their elephants to think about sort of like how their own theology, virtues, morality, like comport with the person that's in the White House currently. And I'm curious if there are any parallels or if you have any insight on what was sort of like the moral dilemmas, Protestant Germans were kind of like reconciling with, and was there kind of like a similar tension there or then as there is today?
Yeah, I think there certainly was. I mean, one point that I've heard, and I'm sure that you follow the kind of contemporary, Christian nationalist discourse, maybe somewhat more closely than I do. But one point that I've heard at least some, let's say pro-Trump, pastors make to reconcile that, which one could also hear in the German context in the earlier 20th century, right, is this idea of needing to keep sort of the spheres of politics and religion separately, right? That what belongs to, the state is the states and what belongs to God is God's. And for, Luther, sort of Martin Luther building on, Augustine's sort of city of God, city of man distinction. Luther talks about the two kingdoms, which is sort of this, complicated theological idea, but, has to do with, the notion that sort of, we live in this sort of fallen world that's not yet saved, and therefore we need sort of political order, political authority to kind of preserve order within the world, and that the Christian ethic of sort of love and grace applies in the sphere of the church that sort of points to our salvation. But the Christian can't necessarily apply those ethics in sort of the political world, which has fallen and therefore has to be kind of controlled by the governing authorities. And so there is, I think, that kind of theology that can be in some sense manipulated, right, to argue that Christians should simply follow the political authority no matter what. Of course, itself, I think that theology is somewhat, problematic. I mean, first of all, Luther himself talks about in certain cases the right of resistance, especially when like a tyrant threatens the sort of very essence of the church and the church's own autonomy. And also, of course, Christian nationalists, both today and in sort of, 20s and 30s Germany, right, weren't, simply saying, well, we should just like follow the ruling authorities because they have been instituted by God, right? Like they don't say that about Democrats, and Christians, nationalists in Germany didn't say that about the Weimar Republic. But when it's a political leader that they,
right.
Like politically, then you have this discourse, well, yes, he may not be, a good Christian, but ultimately, he's not our preacher, and we're sort of following political authority, and then like religious values is something in the religious sphere. So I think that, the way that kind of distinction can get manipulated, I've seen that, in the U.S. context as well.
I mean, I think we're seeing that in the U.S. context. I mean, I'm not trying to say you need to say anything different than what you just did, but as I'm looking at it and I'm hearing this, I'm like, this is exactly what's happening, in the sense that, maybe not exactly, but it's very similar in the sense that, hey, we're taking a president. I've literally heard those words. Look, it went from can't vote, bad character. Bill Clinton, he was awful. He was the devil. He was the Antichrist. He was all sorts of things. And Hillary, don't even get started on Hillary. Okay. Killary is what she's really called. And I can't tell you how many people have said that to me. And then this character, oh, the terrible character. And then now, oh, it's Cyrus. It's, it doesn't matter. He's our president. He's not my pastor. He's my president. All of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what in the world? Can't we see it? But we don't, but it's like, we can't. You can speak on whatever you want to, because honestly, this is kind of the last question. And it's really, what would you want to leave our audience with? in terms of lessons learned
Mhm.
that we would say we really need to be thinking about this right now in any context that we're in? Because believe it or not, this does go international. There are people that
Mhm.
listen to this in other countries,
Mhm.
in other contexts. So maybe they're not in the American context, but
Mhm.
they see similarities or hear things or whatever. What are the lessons learned, and yeah, what do you hope people are gaining and doing from
Right, sure. And certainly there's kind of religious nationalists in other contexts. I mean, I think that, I was thinking about this also after listening to the interview with Brian Kaler, which I would also refer your listener, if you're listening to this and you haven't listened to that, I think it's super interesting and speaks directly to the contemporary context. And, so there's this idea which, I could see why he's putting forth, right, that the sort of the corrective to sort of Christian nationalism is sort of a return to a more kind of authentic reading of the Bible, right, to sort of disrupt these very tendentious theologies. And this was also an idea that one sees like in the post-war German context, and needs to sort of authentically return to the Lutheran confessions or to kind of scripture to overcome some of the theological errors. And certainly I would, in any context, I think that's important, but I think it's also important to recognize, and I say this less as a kind of historian, but also maybe also from my own, context in the Jewish community, right, that people are turning to religion, um, not only to develop an authentic understanding of their sacred texts, or what was the message that Jesus really wanted to get across 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. I mean, I think some people are interested in that, right? But many, I mean, people ultimately want their religious communities and their religious faiths to speak to them where they are, in their lives
absolutely,
today, right? They want it
absolutely.
to be relevant. And I think that one thing that Christian nationalists or other religious nationalist groups, sometimes do very well. And one sees this both in the context that I'm looking at in 1920s and 30s Germany, and also today, right? It's sort of, using the tools of the mass media, sort of using popular culture and speaking to people where they are today. Certainly in the U.S. context today, you would have to look at, sort of race and gender as key factors in framing the kind of grievances that Christian nationalists use to speak to a certain largely white segment of the Protestant population. In Germany in the 20s and 30s, there were a sort of a different set of grievances that were also being used. But ultimately, they're able to sort of effectively use the media to kind of speak to their audience and speak a language that sort of melds Christianity with the concerns that people have today. And I think that the question for people who are part of faith communities are sort of interested in these issues, right, is how do people who want a more ecumenical sort of internationalist or democratic or whatever sort of facing version of their faith, how can they also address the sort of underlying issues that lead people to seek kind of solutions in this sort of nationalistic language. And I don't necessarily have the answer, but I think that needs to be the question. And I think, yes, returning to a more authentic religious message is part of it, but I don't think that can, given how we've seen that, scripture can be manipulated in so many ways, I don't think that's the full solution. So I think that's one thing we need to think about, is why does this religious nationalism appeal
Yes.
to people?
What is appealing about it? And is there something in a good way that we can harness that energy in a non-manipulative,
Mm-hmm.
non-coercive way? And that's hard to do
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
without using propaganda, like the same
Mm-hmm.
tactics essentially
Mm-hmm.
that the Nazis used,
Mm-hmm.
which so many people have borrowed. Well, man, Brandon, this is so fast. I'm telling you, I could keep talking, and I think maybe we should have you back on because it's just your expertise is so clear in this, and I just appreciate your book. I appreciate the conversation. How can people? Is there a preferred bookstore that you'd like them to get the book from? Do your shameless plug of your book, shameless plug of anything you're doing that you want people to get involved in or follow you in. Now's the time to do that. We'd love for you to do that.
Sure. So the book is called Reinventing Protestant Germany. You can buy it wherever you get your book. So it's published by Harvard University Press, and it's available on their website, but also Amazon or Barnes and Noble or bookshop.com. It's also available as an ebook, I think, for a 5% discount through Amazon.
Come on, somebody.
You can follow me on, so I'm on Twitter at BrandonBloch5. I could maybe give you the link to put in my,
Yes.
to put on your YouTube. But it's great to be with you, and I really appreciated our conversation.
Yeah, same here. And guys, you heard it from Brandon. We'll put links into the description and show notes so you can collect and get the book and go to all the websites. We appreciate you guys. Make sure you like, subscribe, do all that great stuff. And if you've made it to this point, you're a true warrior and a fan. So thank you. And guys, until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless.